And a new stuffed doggy. Huh. Give the doggy kisses. Oh, thank you.
He had shown no signs of distress in utero. His vitals were fine. My vitals were fine. Everything appeared to be normal. So after Jaxon was born, his initial APGAR scores were good, but they fell really fast and they were having a hard time getting him to cry. So at that point, they took him to the NICU, and Tim went with them. Then I stayed in.
So I went back with Jaxon, and they took him back to the NICU. And at first, they just told me, well, he's not breathing very well. We just need to help him. By the time we had gotten him into the NICU with the doctors, I was following them. He was basically crashing. So a team of doctors, there was probably 6 or 7, started rushing around his bedside to help him. And at this point, they wouldn't let me stay there any longer, and I had to go wait in a consultation room for a little while. And I waited there, and then one of the head doctor came in and told me that it's probably going to be a little while. That he's breathing now, but he's needing some help to breathe, and they've got to work on him a little bit, and it'd be a little while before we could see him. So they sent me back to the room with Audra, and at that point we just had to wait.
So we waited 4 hours before we could see him, and then so after 4 hours, the head pediatrician and the neurologist came in, and they kind of let us know that Jax had what was called persistent pulmonary hypertension. So his heart wasn't working properly and wasn't oxygenating the blood properly. So the oxygenation wasn't even across his body. One side of his body was being oxygenated better than the other, and that was because of the blood pressure around his heart. He also had, it's called acidosis, so his blood level, or his blood, was too acidic. And then they also said that he had suffered what's called an HIE, it's hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, and it was basically oxygen deprivation at some point in utero. They don't know when it happens or what happens even with the advances in maternal and neonatal monitoring. They don't know what causes it or when it causes it. They don't know how to prevent it. They just know that it happens. About 60% of babies who are diagnosed with HIE, they're either dead by the time they're 2 or severely mentally retarded.
One of the things that happened right at this point too was they did an ultrasound of Jackson's brain, and on the ultrasound it showed a big dark spot on his brain.
Significant discoloration in like the mid portion of his brain.
Right, the portion that is basically life functions. And so the doctor told us that he would probably be severely mentally handicapped, if not more or less could be even a vegetable or a vegetative state. So this was probably the hardest day of our lives. I mean, without even being close. When you hear that your child may not have a very good quality of life from the day he's born, there's nothing in the world that breaks your heart more. So they started Jaxon on this cooling protocol to try to save some of his brain function. And then in addition to that, he had about every machine that the NICU offers hooked up to him, including brain scans and heart scans and stuff to help with his blood and stuff to help with his heart and stuff to help with his brain and his lungs. And at this point, it was pretty hard. We didn't know how much hope there was. We weren't even allowed to touch him. He was laying in the NICU, and they said just the shock of us touching him could hurt him.
Too much stimulation could make could make the brain damage worse. And so we weren't allowed to like kiss him or hold him. He was 10 days old before I was allowed to hold him. And so they did the cooling and did the brain ultrasound. But the brain ultrasound could only tell him so much. So they had to do an MRI to determine just how much brain damage there was and what portions of his brain would be affected, because without the MRI they wouldn't be able to definitively tell us that. So they told us that, you know, we should expect severe mental retardation and or a vegetable, but that once we were able to warm him and he was able to have the MRI, then they would be able to definitively kind of tell us a little bit more about what to expect with his quality of life or lack thereof.
Making a plan.
Point, I had left the hospital and had gone home without him, which was rough. That was a hard day to go home from the hospital without a baby. It could have been worse though. We were still hopeful at this point that eventually we would be able to take him home, whereas a lot of people, they don't ever get to take a baby home. So we were grateful for that.
We were. And this is kind of where starts Jaxon's real story.
Yeah. So they take him over and do the MRI, and we're sitting at the dinner table at home with my mom, and we get a call. I think was it the neurologist who called us first? I think it was the pediatrician. We got like 3 phone calls, and so we get a call from the pediatrician. They're like, "We have great news. Like Jackson's MRI came back clean," and so she's like, basically like it's a miracle. Like there's just his MRI came back normal. So
and we can't explain it.
Yeah, and they said we can't definitively tell you that there won't be any delays or anything, but like it came back normal. So I mean his prognosis is really good at this point. And then we got a call, I think from the nurse as well, and the nurse called to tell us the same news. And then the neurologist called, and I said, "Well, you're the 3rd person to call." And she said, "Well, you just don't understand. Like we hardly ever get to tell anyone good news like this, because it's always bad news that we're having to deliver. So the chance to call someone and give them amazing news like this, like everyone just wants to be able to participate in that and to be able to share that good news." And so after that, it was still,
Well, Jaxon stayed in the NICU for 2 weeks.
14 days.
Now, what's significant about that is that 2 weeks is such a short amount of time for any baby to stay in the NICU. Even babies that are mostly healthy and just born early are a lot of times a lot more time in the NICU than 2 weeks.
So we left the hospital not on any heart medication. There was no blood pressure medication. There were no sedatives. There was no oxygen. We were on room air. We were eating on our own. There were no feeding tubes, and we did this all in a matter of 2 weeks. I would like to say that that's because I got to hold him finally 10 days after he was born, and once I held him, his jaundice went away, and it was about 4 or 5 days after that we were finally able to take him home.